You drive a nice car, dress sharp, speak politely. Out here, you're still just a black man who doesn't know his place. 2 white cops pulled Elijah Monroe over at midnight just because he looked too polished in their neighborhood. No laws broken, no resistance. Still slammed down like he was nothing. What they didn't know, Elijah's a U.S. Army colonel, and he didn't call a lawyer, he called the Pentagon. When justice wears a uniform, who's really in control? What state are you in? Would this happen where you live? Drop your comment, because this story deserves to go all the way. The charcoal-colored SUV rolled smoothly through the southern night, its engine humming softly like the steady breath of a seasoned man. Elijah Monroe, a 52-year-old Army colonel, had driven more than 200 miles from the Pentagon to his home without turning on the music. He preferred silence after strategy meetings, where every decision walked the line between life and death. The phone in the center console still glowed with a message from his wife. "I left stew on the stove. Don't eat too late." He smiled and turned off the screen. Tonight, there were no helicopters, no map overlays covered in coded commands, just him, the stretch of asphalt, and one last bridge leading into the peaceful countryside of Georgia. Or at least, that's what he thought. The night air carried a chill, but it was a pleasant one. Scattered amber lights from nearby farms appeared and vanished in turn. Elijah eased off the gas, not because he was tired, but because he wanted to savor each rotation of the wheels as if shedding remnants of rank, orders, and uniform with every mile. He thought about his youngest daughter, about to graduate from med school, the one who once said she'd heal the things war could never read, about the speech he needed to write for next week's Veterans Conference, and about an old promise that one day, when he was no longer in uniform, he would drive down roads without the weight of suspicious stares. One day. That was when the flashing lights appeared in the rearview mirror, blue, red, pulsing like a warning heartbeat. Elijah frowned. No speeding, headlights on, no violations. The left lane had a construction sign, but he'd merged well before the half-mile mark. He knew because he had trained himself to double-check every move past traffic cams. The habit of a black man who always had to stay alert, even when doing nothing wrong. He slowly turned on the signal and pulled over. His eyes stayed fixed on the mirror, locked onto the patrol car lights, as if trying to read the intentions of whoever sat behind the wheel. His engine died down. Silence returned. But it wasn't the same calming silence from minutes ago. This one shortened the breath. Elijah placed both hands on the wheel, palms up, just like he had taught young soldiers about what to do when you're pulled over. He looked into the mirror, and 2 figures stepped out. The patrol car's headlights flooded his cabin, masking faces and glare. All he could make out was one shorter figure walking quickly and decisively. A voice barked, sharp and emotionless. "Turn off the engine. Hands on the wheel. Don't make me say it again." Elijah didn't respond, but his heartbeat slowed, because he knew some commands weren't meant to manage a situation. They were meant to trigger something irreversible. He switched on the car's cabin light. His hand stayed on the wheel, palms up, the glow casting a stern, yet weary look on his face. This wasn't his first time being pulled over, but never before had that familiar feeling carried such a deep, tired sigh. Outside, boots struck pavement in a steady rhythm. A squat figure neared the driver's side, his shadow spilling across the hood like a slow, unfair audit. Behind, another man, taller, hand near his weapon, moved diagonally to position himself at the rear of the vehicle. The window lowered. Cold air rushed in. Elijah turned his face, locking eyes with the first officer, Rick Halverson. Dust still clinging to his uniform sleeves, small, hardened eyes, a buzz cut. Elijah spoke slowly, respectfully. "What am I being stopped for, officer?" No answer came. Rick scanned the car interior, then let out a scoffing laugh. "This car? You didn't rent it, did you? Elijah 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 didn't rent it, did you?" Behind Jason Griggs, the deputy officer, tall, a radio strapped to his shoulder, his face set and unreadable, spoke up. "Registration, now." Elijah shifted his right hand slowly, speaking clearly. "I'm reaching for my wallet in the side compartment." No one replied. He opened the compartment, pulled out his wallet, then extracted his license and registration and handed them through the window. Rick snatched them with a glance like they were of no value. He read the name, but didn't repeat it. Elijah thought about speaking again, but stayed quiet. He'd seen that look before, on overseas missions, in war zones, and sadly, right here at home. It wasn't the look of justified suspicion. It was the gaze of someone who had already assigned guilt based on skin color. Rick looked at the documents for less than 5 seconds, then stuffed them into his shirt pocket without handing them back. He leaned in, elbow on the window frame, eyes drifting over the dashboard. "Where are you driving from?" he asked, but didn't wait for an answer. "Never mind." His voice dropped, low and heavy like a battlefield command. "Step out of the car. Now." Elijah didn't move, but his heartbeat slowed by half, not out of fear, but because he knew. Those words weren't just an order. They were the start of something wrong, coming closer, again. Elijah stepped out of the car as if he'd rehearsed the movement 100 times. His hands were raised, not above shoulder level, but high enough to leave no room for misinterpretation. His gestures were firm, slow, and exact, not out of fear, but because he knew too well. Any misstep could be framed as a threat. He stood still, feet shoulder-thin apart, eyes neither lowered nor defiant. Rick Halverson stopped in front of him, no more than an arm's length away. His breath reeked of old coffee and menthol cigarettes, a smell that didn't sharpen the senses but burned the eyes. Behind them, Jason Griggs remained near the trunk, his right hand hovering near his Glock, like the weapon had a mind of its own that needed calming. Rick scanned Elijah from head to toe. Dark coat, light gray tie, slacks, and shoes polished to a gleam. The kind of look you'd expect in government buildings or luxury sedans, not on a dusty roadside in rural Georgia at midnight. "What do you do for a living?" Rick asked, voice tinged with disdain. "Someone like you driving this kind of car? Not exactly common around here." Elijah didn't frown or sigh. He just replied evenly, "I'm heading home." Rick sneered. "Home? Where's that? The row of shacks down the hill, or the trailer park out back?" He scoffed like he'd seen this type before. Black, nice car, polite words, and definitely something to uncover. Elijah stayed silent, because every answer had already been pre-written in the mind of the man standing in front of him, and also because, in that fleeting moment, an old memory came rushing back. The night 8 years ago when he and his son were stopped at a gas station for looking like someone who'd stolen a car. That night, his son had asked, "Did it hurt, Dad?" Elijah had said no, but truthfully, he just didn't want his child to know that some looks hurt worse than punch like the one Rick was giving him now. Rick stepped closer, now standing to Elijah's left, his head angled to take in both man and vehicle at once. He didn't ask anything else, just muttered, "Too clean a car." Elijah held his stance, though his eyes flickered. Jason still hadn't said a word, but nodded slightly, as if everything was going according to plan. Rick glanced over, then began circling the car, moving slowly, almost like a stroll, but clearly searching for something, or ready to invent it if nothing appeared. Elijah knew this script well, and he also knew it never ended simply. Rick stopped in front of the car, turned back now less than a forearm's length from Elijah. He looked at him the way a man inspects cargo, not to verify legality, but to find a flaw, a crack, a place to stick a damning label. "Have you ever been arrested?" Rick asked, voice featherlight, but words weighted. Without waiting for an answer, he continued, "Anyone in your family ever get charged? Your father, brother, some cousin, maybe?" Elijah looked him straight in the eyes, calm and firm. "I'm not obligated to answer unless you have probable cause." Rick raised his eyebrows, smirked. Behind them, Jason, still hovering near his holster, shook his head like he'd just heard something foolish. "That kind of attitude doesn't help, buddy," he said, his tone edged with an unmasked threat. Elijah didn't respond, because he knew here cooperation didn't mean transparency. It meant submission. Rick gave a dry laugh, then suddenly shoved Elijah lightly on the shoulder. Not hard, but enough to blur the line between inspection and provocation. "I see how it is," Rick said through clenched teeth. "Black folks with money always got that superiority look, like they gotta prove people like me wrong." Elijah drew a deep breath. In his chest was a heavy anger, not explosive, but solid, like whetstone. "Don't touch me unless you have legal cause," he said, each word sharp and solid, like a command from basic training. Rick stepped half a pace back, maybe realizing he'd overstepped, but his eyes didn't retreat. He wasn't smiling anymore, but the arrogance etched into his face was deeper than any crease at the corners of his mouth. "Let me be real," he said, lowering his voice gravelly like he had to drag the words out of his throat. "You can drive a nice car, wear a suit, speak politely, but out here, right now, you're just a black man who doesn't know his place." Elijah didn't flinch, didn't glance at Jason, didn't shift his gaze. Only his lips tightened slightly, like the last gate sealing in every ounce of self-restraint. And Rick, he just stood there, eyes locked on Elijah's, as if counting the seconds until the man in front of him made a single mistake. The pavement was freezing. Beneath the uneven asphalt lay gravel and grime, but Elijah felt none of it, only the impact of Rick Halverson's boot slamming into his back. The kick wasn't just an outburst. It was a final declaration from someone trying to assert control over a man he couldn't break with words. Elijah fell face first to the ground, one hand bracing instinctively, cheek turned sideways, dust scraping lightly against his skin. But he didn't cry out, didn't groan, didn't turn his head. His body touched dirt, but his presence stayed where it belonged, upright. Rick circled in front of him, crouched as if to find something in Elijah's eyes. Satisfaction, maybe, but what he saw wasn't the gaze of someone defeated. It was the silence of a man who was recording everything. "Still not enough for you?" Rick hissed. He dropped to one knee, pressing a firm hand into Elijah's shoulder like he was trying to pin down a stone ready to rise. "Obstruction? Resisting a check? Non-compliance? Want me to add more?" And Elijah remained silent. The wind swept across the road, carrying the scent of old oil and dry leaves. Jason stood behind Rick, hand still near his weapon, watching, but not stepping in. It wasn't approval, not yet resistance either, just hesitation. Rick gripped Elijah's shoulder tighter, hissed through clenched teeth. "Why aren't you saying anything? Scared now?" Elijah turned his head slightly, not away but directly toward Jason. The cruiser's light cast a glow past Jason's shoulder, reflecting in Elijah's eyes, a faint gleam, not bright, but unextinguishable. Jason paused, then leaned down, just low enough so only the three of them could hear. "He's not like the others." The words weren't for Rick, nor were they an apology. They were recognition, laced with something bitter. That was when Elijah finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper, not out of weakness, but because his calm made others strain to hear. "I know what you're afraid of." Rick laughed, a brittle sound, half mockery, half shaken. "Afraid of what? You're under my boot," he spat, every word a rehearsal of dominance. But Elijah turned his head back. Blood had dried at the corner of his mouth, leaving a crusted streak, but his eyes were steady, brighter than when he was standing. "Afraid of a man who doesn't beg?" Rick sprang to his feet as if yanked, not because of the words, but because of that look, the same one he'd seen in people with nothing left to lose, but this time it came from someone who hadn't lost anything. Jason took a step back, handing off his gun. For the first time all night, his shoulders slumped, not because he feared Elijah, but because he realized Rick did, and that fear didn't stem from power, but from the shadow of a man lying on the ground, still refusing to bow. The turning point came not with a gunshot, not a punch, but a stare that wouldn't drop, a knee that didn't belong to the earth. Elijah remained still, unmoving like a boundary marker no one had the right to displace. Rick's bitter words had just ended, and the air around them thickened. Yet Elijah didn't lower his head, didn't turn away, and didn't talk back. Only his eyes, Rick's one ungovernable element, remained steady and deep, as if observing a creature both familiar and insignificant. Rick sneered, the kind of smile a man makes when defiance shows up in exactly the wrong place. "Kneel," he said. This time the sarcasm was gone. His voice was a cold command. Elijah didn't answer, didn't move. The words didn't reach him because they didn't come from any legitimate authority, only from delusion. Jason began to move, stepping from behind the car to Elijah's right side. The streetlight caught the edge of the gun at his hip. His hand touched the holster lightly, not drawing, but enough to make the warning real. Rick stepped in close, now only inches from Elijah. "I said kneel. Now." His voice grew hoarser, anger rising through the tight muscles of his face. Elijah tilted his head slightly, gave a short answer. "No," tried one word, but it hit Rick like a can of boiling fuel. He shouted, then suddenly shoved Elijah in the chest with both hands. The push wasn't that strong, at least not for a former soldier, but it was enough to throw him off balance. Elijah dropped to one knee, one hand brushing the pavement for support. His head lowered slightly, but his back stayed straight. He didn't try to get up, didn't collapse either. He simply held that position like a breath caught in the lungs. Rick stepped back a pace, as if to take in his result, but the moment his eyes met Elijah's still lifted gaze, he hesitated. Elijah wasn't resisting, but the way he looked at Rick, not begging, not defiant, just quietly waiting for Rick to see himself, was more disturbing than any insult. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Rick snarled, fists clenched, temple pulsing. Elijah just breathed slowly, locking his eyes onto Rick's like a mirror, not of his face, but of his actions. The pavement was ice cold. Beneath the uneven asphalt were gravel and grime, but Elijah felt nothing except the pressure of Rick Halverson's boot slamming into his back. The kick wasn't just an outburst of rage. It was the final statement of a man trying to assert dominance over someone he couldn't break with words. Elijah fell forward, catching himself with one arm, cheek hitting the dirt, grains of sand scraping lightly against his skin. But he didn't cry out, didn't groan, didn't turn his head. His body was on the ground, but his spirit remained upright. Rick walked around to his head, bent down as if to find satisfaction in Elijah's eyes. But what he saw wasn't defeat. It was the silence of someone recording everything. "Still not enough for you?" Rick ground his teeth. He knelt halfway, pressing his hand hard onto Elijah's shoulder, as if trying to hold down a boulder that might spring up at any second. Obstructing an officer, interfering with an investigation, non-compliance. "You want to add anything else?" Elijah remained silent. Wind swept across the road, bringing the scent of old oil and dry leaves. Jason stood behind Rick, hand still near his gun, watching, not intervening. Not in agreement, not yet in protest, just uncertain. Rick tightened his grip on Elijah's shoulder, his whisper now a near hiss. "Why aren't you saying anything? Scared now, huh?" Elijah slowly turned his head, not to avoid, but to look directly at Jason. The light from the squad car shone past Jason's shoulder, catching in Elijah's eyes a faint glint, not blazing, but impossible to extinguish. Jason froze slightly, then bent down just enough so only the three of them could hear. "He's not like the others." The words weren't for Rick, and they weren't an apology. They were recognition, laced with bitter truth. Then Elijah finally spoke, his voice soft, not from weakness, but from a calm that demanded attention. "I know what you're afraid of." Rick let out a dry laugh, half surprise, half surprise. "Afraid? You're under my boot." He snapped each word as if needing to remind himself of his role, but Elijah turned his head fully now, blood dried at the corner of his mouth, gaze unwavering and brighter than when he'd stood. "Afraid of a man who doesn't need to beg." Rick shot to his feet like someone had pulled a wire. It wasn't the words, it was that look he'd seen before in people with nothing left to lose, but this time it came from someone who hadn't lost anything at all. Jason stepped back, his hand leaving the gun. For the first time that night, his shoulders slumped, not from fear of Elijah, but from realizing Rick was afraid, and that fear didn't come from a loss of power, but from the shadow of a man lying on the ground who still refused to bow. The shift in power didn't come from a bullet or a fist. It began with a stare that wouldn't lower, a knee that didn't belong to the dirt. Rick crouched, one hand resting on his knee, the other hovering near the stock of his gun as if still ready to draw, though no one was threatening him. He stayed silent for a few seconds. The scene no longer felt like a suburban roadside, but more like a sealed room, where Rick decided who had the right to lift their head. Elijah remained still, lit obliquely by the police car's headlights, the badge on Rick's chest casting a dark slash across his cheek. Rick tilted his head, voice dropping to a razor-sharp whisper. "You're smart, know how to talk, know when to shut up," but he curled his lip and spat the words. "Smart for a black man." Jason stood behind him, saying nothing, but his eyes flicked to Rick and lingered on Elijah's face for a beat. Something felt wrong. Not in Rick's words, he'd heard worse, but in the silence from the man across. Elijah didn't react, didn't snap, didn't even question it, and that's what unsettled Jason most. It felt like a knife had cut through the air, leaving no blood, just a dense vacuum. Rick continued, leaning in close to Elijah's ear, his breath mixing faint cigarette staleness with something more twisted. Satisfaction. "You can be taught, trained, lifted up, but you're still just a monkey in clothes." In that moment, the night air stopped being cool. Elijah didn't flinch, but his back pulled tight. His shoulders locked for a breath. Dried blood cracked at the corner of his mouth as it shifted, not to speak, but simply to move. His eyes opened a fraction wider, fixed on Rick, unblinking. Not defiant, but the gaze of someone forged through years of facing men with guns and no humanity. In his mind, there was no scream, just the silence of a soldier who once held dozens of lives steady in the line of fire, because he knew that if he shot first, he'd lose. Elijah's right hand began to clench against the pavement, gritty sand scraping between his fingers. Not a fist for striking, but one grasping an invisible cord stretched to its limit. Rick straightened up, scanning the scene like a man who'd just stomped out a spark before it caught flame. He glanced at Jason, lips pressed as if waiting for approval, but Jason didn't look at him. He looked down at Elijah, then turned away, not out of fear, but because he couldn't bring himself to meet the eyes that still burned bright from the lowest ground. Silence fell among the three men. This time, one Rick, no longer controlled. Elijah didn't need to speak. His entire body was speaking for him. "I was never beneath you and you know it." Elijah began to rise. Not with haste, not with resistance, and without waiting for any signal of permission. Every movement was deliberate, guided by deep, steady breaths, like someone mastering their pain to keep it from clouding thought. He braced one hand on the asphalt, balanced on his knee, then slowly lifted his spine until he stood upright again, though still below his opponent. There was no rush, as if lifting his head was no longer a choice, but an inevitability of survival. Rick whipped around, 2 fast steps closing the gap in an instant. "Sit down!" he barked, like a cornered beast's final growl. "Who told you to lift your head?" His voice was hoarse now, but unsure. No longer a command, just reflex, startled by what he thought was weakness rising without asking. Elijah met his eyes, didn't bow. No challenge, no hatred, just a look that had stopped agreeing to play the victim, and for the first time he spoke, his voice carrying the steadiness of a man who once kept an entire unit still under midnight rain, where every word had to land with precision. "What you just said," Elijah stated slowly, clearly, "wasn't just aimed at me, it was aimed at everyone like me. No rage, no need for dramatics, but the words dropped into the air like a verdict without a gavel. Behind them, Jason dipped his head slightly. His face tightened, not from fear, but because something was starting to break. Not the moment, but his awareness. Suddenly, Rick's words didn't sound like official duty anymore. They were a dumping ground for something Jason wasn't sure he wanted to represent. Rick laughed, a dry, clipped sound that lasted less than 2 seconds before snuffing out. as if he didn't even believe what he was laughing at. "Listen, Colonel No Name," Rick said, tilting his head, trying to reclaim the upper hand. "In this town, we know your type. You all think you're special." Elijah didn't answer, just watched him, and then, in a voice low and honed like a newly whetted blade, he said, "The issue isn't what you call me. It's that you think you can call me that, and nothing will happen." The silence that followed was absolute. No one spoke. Jason shifted, just half a step to the right, almost unconsciously pulling himself out from Rick's shadow. A small movement, but in Elijah's eyes it was the first crack in a wall long thought unbreakable. Rick stood still, his face unchanged, but his gaze faltered. Just for a second, as if, for the first time, he had to ask himself, if I can't humiliate someone without consequence, then who am I? Elijah didn't need the answer. He just sat there, back straight, eyes fixed on two men now forced to see themselves when there was no one left below to trample. "Let me make a call," Elijah said, his voice calm, as if he were suggesting something entirely reasonable. No raised tone, no demand, just a request, though it came from a man unaccustomed to asking for permission. Rick paused for half a second, then let out a short laugh. "A call? To a lawyer? Or your mama?" His tone was mocking, as if Elijah's words were some kind of joke in the middle of the night. Jason, standing nearby, shrugged slightly and nodded at Rick. "Let him call. Let's see who comes to the rescue." They still thought they were in control. They didn't know where the real control lay. Elijah didn't respond to any of the taunts. He simply reached his right hand slowly into the inside chest pocket of his jacket. A clear, deliberate motion. No rush. No surprises. Jason kept an eye on him, his hand still hovering near his holster, but didn't interfere. Rick stood right beside him, the car's headlights casting a glare that highlighted beads of sweat on his temple. Elijah pulled out his phone, angled it slightly toward the light to see clearly, but didn't open his contacts. He typed each number without looking, without hesitation, as if he'd memorized the sequence decades ago. The phone rang halfway through its first tone, when a deep, commanding voice answered, "No introduction needed." "General Robert Anderson speaking." Jason squinted. Rick froze for a beat. Elijah raised the phone a little closer, his tone steady. "It's me, Elijah Monroe. I'm having an issue with two local officers here in Georgia." The air stiffened like frozen glass. Rick didn't react immediately. His brain was scrambling to process the name, trying to piece together fragments that hadn't clicked yet. Jason, unlike his usual smug self, dropped his smirk. His eyebrows lifted slightly, as if he'd just heard a name that wasn't ordinary. Elijah didn't look at either of them. He just stood there, back straight, one hand holding the phone, the other resting silently at his side, not to appear threatening, but to maintain a posture he'd lived with all his life, the stance of someone ready to give orders, or to shield others from the wrong ones. But this time, the order was for himself, and neither of the men in front of him knew that within seconds, they would no longer be the ones in control tonight. "You all right?" General Anderson's tone shifted immediately, from calm to alert. "Who made contact with you?" Elijah maintained his stance, eyes locked on the two men before him. His reply was clear, each word like a marker that couldn't be erased. "Rick Halverson and Jason Griggs. I'll send a photo for confirmation." Without hesitation, Elijah lowered the phone slightly and raised it to take a picture. No warning, no request. 2 clicks followed, one from the camera, one from the auto-verification system. His fingers moved quickly, sending the image and location. It all took less than 10 seconds. Rick squinted, stepping forward a bit, his voice no longer mocking, but tinged with unformed doubt. "Who the hell are you calling?" Elijah didn't turn, didn't look at him. He raised the phone back to his mouth and said firmly, "I need them to stand down immediately. I'm not safe." That sentence wasn't just a statement of fact. It was a trigger for action. Rick opened his mouth, but just then, Jason's shoulder radio blinked to life. A short beep, followed by the voice of a state-level dispatcher, cold, unyielding, beyond dispute, cut through the night. "Halverson, Griggs, you are detaining someone you are not authorized to detain. That is Elijah Monroe. Stand down immediately. That is an order." Rick went still. Jason spun to look at Elijah. For the first time that night, his eyes wide, not with anger but with shock. Elijah didn't move, didn't change expression, as if he'd known that exchange would happen, as if every word from the radio was just a recording of something he'd memorized long ago. Rick took a step back. He looked up slowly at Elijah, and for the first time there was no power in his eyes, no smirking recognition of a truth that couldn't be undone. He'd messed with the wrong man, a man he never imagined he'd have to bow to. But tonight, he had no other choice. As the radio fell silent, the air between the three men seemed to vanish. Rick stood frozen, his face pale, not from cold, but from having nothing left to say. The muscles in his face were clenched tight, like he was trying to keep his legs from buckling. Jason stood at an angle, hands still near his holster, not out of defense anymore, but out of a habit he hadn't had time to shake while his mind went numb. In that moment, every insect's chirp, every background sound dissolved. Only the heartbeat of a man who knew he'd just stepped through a door he should never have opened remained. Elijah didn't rush. He slowly reached into his coat, the motion smooth and deliberate, as if he'd done it 1,000 times, but this time meant more than any other. A small black leather wallet emerged. He unfolded one corner of the trifold. Under the patrol car's light, an ID card was fully visible. No embellishment, no oversized font, just cold, clear lines. Colonel Elijah Monroe, United States Army, the Pentagon. Beside it was a military ID number, a raised silver seal, and the embossed emblem of the U.S. Department of Defense etched into anti-counterfeit polymer. Nothing to dispute, nothing to hide. That small card was the proof of 3 decades of service, and of a truth the two officers could no longer deny. They had pointed a gun at, insulted, threatened, and assaulted a high-ranking federal military officer. Rick opened his mouth but could only emit a muffled sound. He swallowed hard, then stammered like someone waking from a nightmare. "So, it's real?" Jason said nothing. He stepped half a pace toward Elijah, eyes locked on the ID like he was trying to reread every line, every symbol, hoping some clerical error might rescue what was now a collapsing career. But everything on that card was clear as daylight. And clearer still was Elijah's silence, the final affirmation that no further explanation was required. Elijah snapped the wallet shut and returned it to his coat pocket with a decisive motion. He looked at Rick, not from below, not as someone being interrogated, but as a man facing a soldier who'd broken protocol. His voice was low but sharp as a verdict. "Now, I'm the one doing the checking." No one moved, no one dared, because the game had changed. Over a single card they never imagined could flip the entire night. No one answered. Not an apology, not a protest, not even a breath strong enough to power a nod. Elijah stood up slowly without using his hands. He didn't spring up like a man regaining freedom, nor stand in triumph. He simply stood, as naturally as someone who had never fallen. He brushed the dust from his pants in precise, clean motions, as if removing each speck of wrongdoing others had tried to paste onto him. His coat was slightly wrinkled at the shoulders, the dried blood at the corner of his mouth still visible, but his spine was straight, unshaken. Elijah turned. This time his gaze held no resistance or analysis, only certainty. He looked at Rick, not to force him to lower his eyes, but to compel him to see clearly what he had done. "My name," Elijah said, voice low and even, "doesn't need an introduction, but you'll remember it longer than the names you've written on your reports." Every word was cold and solid like steel. No raised voice, no dramatic tone. The restraint made them cut deeper than any shout could. Rick flinched slightly. He tried to speak, as if he'd finally found an excuse for the night's events. "We didn't know," he stammered, unable to maintain eye contact. "No one told us. We couldn't have known who you were." But before the sentence could finish, Elijah cut him off, not loudly, but with just enough weight in his voice for each word to slice through the illusion. "That's exactly how it goes. If I were just another black man, right?" No reply needed. No one could deny that, because it wasn't a question. It was a conclusion. Jason lowered his head slightly. Whether from shame or reconsideration of his entire time in uniform, it was hard to say. Rick stayed silent. His face turned red. Not from anger, but from something harder to admit. He hadn't expected there would be a witness. He thought he'd write another report like so many others, where what he said would be the only truth that mattered. But now, no line he wrote could save him from a name the system would recognize. Elijah said nothing more. He turned away, eyes fixed down the road, where only yellow light stretched across coarse asphalt. His back was straight, his steps unhurried. He didn't look back, because there was no reason to. To him, the night didn't end with retaliation. It ended when those who thought they were the story's center were pushed to the sidelines. And that's exactly what Rick and Jason became. From this moment on, not adversaries, not threats, not even central characters. They were just the past, a faint trace left behind the silhouette of a man they had wrongly believed they could kneel upon. Elijah walked away, carrying a name, unspoken but unforgettable. Elijah took a few steps, then stopped, not because someone called out to him and not because there was anything behind him worth turning back for. He stopped because something needed to be said, not so they would hear it, but so they couldn't forget it. He turned, his eyes sweeping across both Rick and Jason, not with rage, not with hatred, but with a heavy calm, the kind of calm that comes from seeing too many senseless deaths, too many faces buried before they could even resist. His voice rang out slowly, not loud, but each word fell like a heavy stone into the suffocating silence. If I weren't Colonel Elijah Monroe, he paused, then continued, if I were just a regular black man, no rank, no title, no friends at the Pentagon, what would have happened tonight? No one answered. Rick looked away, his jaw clenched as if biting back something unspeakable. Jason stood still, head slightly lowered, not quite out of shame, but like someone just struck by a question they had no idea how to dodge. Elijah stepped forward slowly, not to threaten, not to intimidate, but like a man shining a light straight into the corners others keep buried in their minds. If that call hadn't come through, he said, eyes still fixed forward, if I didn't have that card in my coat, if I weren't listed in military records, if no one in government knew who I was, would I still be standing here? Or would I be lying face down with a bullet through my body? And by morning, just another headline, black man shot for failing to comply with police orders. This time, Rick couldn't hide his unease. He shifted back half a step, his eyes avoiding contact. Jason didn't move, but his hand clenched into a fist, like he was resisting a thought crashing into him that maybe Elijah was right. Maybe it really could have happened. Elijah stood between them, not taller, not bigger, but now he was the center of gravity, a reality they both thought they had control over, but they'd forgotten. In this world, some people don't need weapons to hold power. All they need is the truth. He looked at each of them in turn, demanding no reply, expecting no apology. He ended with one sentence, short, sharp, and heavier than any accusation. You don't have to answer me, but you'll have to answer your own conscience. No one objected. No one smiled. Not a sound escaped, only the wind brushing across the deserted road and the raw feeling of two men stripped of their borrowed power, standing exposed before a question they might never have the courage to face. Jason stood motionless, but his whole body had begun to tremble, not out of fear of lawsuits, not because a complaint might end his career. What made him shudder now was an image flashing through his mind, clear as if someone had projected it straight onto his forehead. Elijah Monroe was not a colonel. He wasn't someone who could make a direct call to the Pentagon. He didn't have that card in his wallet. He didn't have anyone in high places ready to send alerts over the radio. Just a regular black man, wearing a suit, driving an SUV, on a quiet road. Stopped in the middle of the night, Jason turned his face away, not to avoid Elijah, but to block out the storm quietly rolling in. They had been inches away from a wrongful death, and he had almost been a part of it. There was no reason to stand next to Rick anymore. He stepped back toward the edge of the road, removing himself from the orbit of power he once thought was safe. Every belief he had in proper procedure had just shattered, because that procedure was never fair, and he knew it. deep down. He just never dared say it. Rick still tried to cling to the scraps of his old performance. He forced a smile, voice sharp but weightless. "We didn't mean to kill anyone. We were just conducting a routine check." Elijah turned to him, eyes not angry but sharp as a cold blade. "We? Or just you?" he asked, not loud, but with enough precision to slice through every excuse. "You were the one who pulled the gun. You were the one who kicked me in the back. You were the one who called me a well-dressed monkey. Don't say we like responsibility is something you get to divide up." Without waiting for a reply, Elijah spoke again, slowly, like pulling something long buried into the dim yellow light. "I once had a friend, Sergeant Marcus Lyle. We were stationed together in Kandahar. He survived 3 ambushes, 3 gunshot wounds, and nearly 900 days in combat. But he didn't survive a traffic stop in Alabama. The police thought he was reaching for a weapon, but he was just trying to get his house keys out of his back pocket." Rick stood frozen. His hands hung uselessly at his sides. There was no button to erase that story, no incident report that could soften it. Jason didn't lift his head, because the name Marcus Lyle, like so many others, didn't come with a rank to protect them, didn't have a direct line to a commanding officer, and had no one over the radio to order "stand down." Elijah went quiet for a moment. He didn't look at them anymore. His eyes dropped to the empty space on the road between them. In that moment, there was no Rick, no Jason, only the shadows of those not as lucky as him, those who died before they could prove they deserved to live. And he, somehow, was still standing, not because of a badge, but because of the truth. The wind moved slowly. Elijah didn't lift his gaze, but that bow of the head, not for enemies, but for the nameless souls still waiting to be restored, left both men speechless. The night no longer belonged to them, and the only question still echoing in their minds wasn't "how do I cover myself?" but how many never even got the chance to call anyone. The white SUV slid quietly into the scene like a final period at the end of a sentence. No flashing lights, no sirens. It didn't need spectacles. Its mere arrival shifted the entire atmosphere. 3 people stepped out, all in plain clothes, but their posture and gaze unmistakably marked them as a force apart. Leading them was a man in his 50s, salt and pepper hair, squared shoulders, built like someone who hadn't stopped being sharp. That was Chief Raymond Harper, the police department head who never showed up in the middle of the night unless things had already gone beyond control. Jason saw him first. His body twitched, then he immediately stepped back, shifting noticeably away from Rick, as if to distance himself from any connection. Rick tried to maintain composure, but his hand began twitching subtly at his side. Sweat beaded at his collar and dripped to the cold ground like a silent betrayal. Harper said nothing. He walked straight past Jason, then Rick, his gaze sweeping over them like scanning evidence at a crime scene. When he stopped in front of Elijah, he gave a slight nod, not just a greeting, but an acknowledgement. He knew exactly who stood before him. "Colonel Monroe," he said, voice low and restrained. "I'm sorry we have to meet under these circumstances." Elijah gave a slight nod. No handshake, no hostility. His voice calm but weighted. "I hope the people behind the badge understand what they represent." The words hung in the air for a beat. Harper didn't react. He turned instead to Rick and Jason, his tone dropping, cold and final as a verdict. "Effective immediately, you are both suspended. Turn in your badges and weapons, now." Rick stammered, "We haven't filed a report yet. I could—" Harper raised a hand, eyes sharp as steel. "We've reviewed the body cam footage. Don't say another word if you still want the chance to write your report." The sentence didn't just end resistance. It shattered the illusion that they could spin this story like they had before. This time, they weren't the ones holding the pen. The truth had already been broadcast into the night. Harper said nothing more. He simply gestured, and one of the 2 internal affairs officers stepped forward, unzipped a shoulder bag, and pulled out a large tablet with a body cam interface. Without removing the device or asking permission, the officer connected directly to Rick's shoulder mount recorder. The screen lit up. Audio played. Clear, unmistakable, sharp. "This car, I bet you didn't rent it, did you? You can be taught, trained, lifted up, but you're still just a monkey in clothes. Get on your knees. I said get down. Now." The recording repeated the words exactly. No distortion. No signal drop. The things Rick had once thought would vanish into the night air now rang back from the screen like a blade turned inward. Jason stood still, head bowed, eyes averted. He didn't need to watch. He remembered every word. Each one struck like a slap. Not because they were wrong, but because, for the first time, they were being forced to hear them again as evidence. Rick turned pale, his face drained of color. He couldn't form a single word. His hands hung limp, no longer trying to maintain a cop's bearing. The glow from the screen fell directly on his face, no longer an officer's, but a suspect's in uniform. One of the internal affairs officers, small in stature but voice clear like a bell through camp, said flatly, "This isn't a behavioral misstep. This is hate-motivated conduct." The statement carried no emotion and didn't need any. It was a conclusion beyond dispute now that the proof didn't just exist, it came from the very man who could no longer deny it. Harper took a slow breath, his eyes calmly passing over the two men who had once served under him. He wasn't angry. He didn't need to pound the table. He spoke just one sentence, but it nailed shut the door on their careers. There's no place in this profession for anyone who uses power to humiliate others. The air thickened. Jason could barely lift his head. Rick was still standing, but his legs trembled slightly, like someone who'd lost his way. Harper didn't wait for a response. He turned to the internal affairs team and nodded once. Simple, final, non-negotiable. The two IA officers moved in. One took out handcuffs. The other positioned himself beside them, prepared to block any reaction, though everyone here knew no reaction was coming. The click rang out, not as a threat, but as the sound of order, of justice applies the same way to any citizen guilty of a serious breach. Rick was cuffed first. Jason followed. No resistance, no shouting. Just two men in uniform being escorted away in the dead of night, not by some outside force, but by the very system they once believed they could control. And behind them, the screen still glowed, tirelessly replaying every word they had tossed into the dark, never expecting the day it would return to testify against them. Andre pedaled slowly down a quiet street, the food delivery box strapped firmly to his back, the scent of grilled meat mixing with the crisp night air. He wasn't thinking much. This was the last delivery of his shift. 5 more minutes and he'd be home, wash up, and sleep in peace. But as he neared the bend by an empty lot, red and blue flashing lights lit up the tree branches, making him pause. A black SUV had been pulled over. 2 officers, one shouting, gun in hand, the other standing guard. Instinctively, Andre stopped behind a tree, just enough to stay out of sight. He couldn't see the face of the man being stopped, just that he wore a button-down shirt and had both hands raised, motionless. Rick, the shorter, stockier officer, shouted something, then suddenly kicked the man hard in the back. The body crumpled like a sandbag. Andre's hands trembled. He whispered, "Jesus," then reached for his phone and turned on the camera. He didn't know if what he was doing was right or wrong. He only knew that if he didn't record it now, no one would believe it. Pressed tight against the tree, he held the phone with both shaking hands. In the frame, the man lay still, head turned to one side, not reacting. Rick stepped closer, said something Andre couldn't hear, but he could clearly see the man's eyes. No fear, no begging, just an unsettling calm. 1 minute, 2 minutes. Then came the moment Rick drew his gun and pointed it near the man's face, hissing through clenched teeth. Jason stood by, not intervening. Andre almost dropped his phone. His heart pounded like a war drum, but he kept filming. The lens caught a blurry, frantic scene, but clear enough to show who was who and who was doing what. When the second white SUV pulled up, its headlights lit Rick's face. A voice, deep, commanding, rang out, issuing quick, decisive orders. Andre recognized it instantly. No more yelling, no more chaos, just someone giving orders and others receiving them. Andre knew this was the end of it. He stopped recording. Back home, Andre locked the door and dropped his backpack to the floor. He sank down against the wall, sweat still clinging to his skin. His hands were still trembling as he opened the video he'd just recorded. Each frame made his stomach tighten. A man forced to kneel, cursed at, threatened with a gun, and then, not killed, but barely. He didn't know what to do. Send it to the press, the police, or delete it like nothing had happened. Andre stared at his phone, then opened a chat with his girlfriend, the one who always asked him at night about the things you're not supposed to see. He typed, "If you see this clip posted, it means I either did the right thing or I just invited hell in." The message sat there, unsent, but Andre kept staring at it, as if he already knew. No matter what he decided, tonight had changed him for good. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the thin curtains of Andre's small room. His phone had been buzzing non-stop since before sunrise. Notifications from news outlets, friends, and group chats. The name Elijah Monroe filled the screen. Mainstream media had picked up on a confrontation between police and a high-ranking military officer. A black man pulled over in the middle of the night, detained, then somehow flipped the entire situation with a single phone call. Andre read every word, eyes fixed on the updates, fingers scrolling fast, searching for one thing. Where's the body cam footage? Where's the proof? Why do they write possible procedural violation but never say who did what? Inside him, something itched like a splinter under the skin. Not sharp, but impossible to ignore. Then he saw the phrase, "placed on temporary leave," under Rick Halverson's photo. Andre set the phone down on the table, lowering his head for a few seconds, as if trying to escape the question that had just popped into his mind. What if Elijah wasn't a colonel? What if no one had recorded from the outside? He knew, deep down, if you waited for the system to bring the truth to light, it might never come. Without letting himself think further, Andre picked up the phone and replayed the 2-minute, 47-second clip. His hands still shook slightly as he tapped the share icon. Under the description, he wrote just one line. "Not everyone has a radio to save them, but someone saw." The uploader's name wasn't Andre, but an anonymous handle, @streetjeb. In less than 10 minutes, the clip began to spread. The view count climbed exponentially. Within the first 3 hours, 10,000 shares. Major voices in human rights circles reposted it, tagging and adding hashtags. Some federal attorneys got involved, raising questions. Why hadn't the full body cam footage been released? Why did the public have to rely on civilians to see the full story? In town, the air shifted. Conversations at coffee shops, barber shops, and gas stations, once ruled by silence, now buzzed with murmurs and heat. Someone recognized Rick and talked about the time he dragged them out of their car just for daring to make eye contact. Someone else remembered Jason forcing high school kids to pop their trunks right near campus. But before, everyone stayed quiet. Now, not anymore. Andre didn't tell anyone. He didn't post the clip in the group chat, didn't say a word to his mom, but when he opened the post for the 10th time and saw the view count climbing, he sat quietly by the window. Daylight reflected off the glass onto his face, no longer pale, no longer withdrawn. He knew his name wasn't known, but what he saw, what he held on to, had stepped into the light, and for the first time, Andre felt, "I didn't look away." One day, after Andre's video went viral across social media platforms, the response hotline at the Georgia State Police Behavior Oversight Agency became overloaded. Amid hundreds of calls and emails pouring in, a deep, slow, but resolute voice came through at exactly 8:42, aiming, "My name is Douglas Rains. I'm a veteran, and I believe I'm part of something that's been buried." The call taker immediately took notes and transferred him to the independent investigation team recently formed in the aftermath of the Elijah Monroe incident. On the line, Douglas recounted his story, without bitterness, just dry like the deserts he'd once crossed 5 years ago. In March, he parked in a supermarket lot, waiting for his wife to buy medication. A patrol car pulled up. Rick Halverson stepped out. No request for ID, no clear reason, just a vague accusation that the car didn't match the driver. Raines, 58 at the time, still carried his veteran ID in his wallet, but that didn't grant him the right to argue with someone in uniform. When he pushed back, Rick slammed him against the car, cuffed him roughly, dislocating his left shoulder. He wasn't arrested, just detained for an hour for inspection, then released. No apology. The next day, Raines filed a complaint attaching ER documents, photos of the bruising on his R, and a scrape on his shoulder. He sent emails to 3 addresses in the Internal Affairs Network. No one replied. 2 weeks later, he received a short message from the police office. Insufficient grounds for action. No witness or independent evidence. Case closed. But 5 years later, when he saw Rick Halverson and Andre's video, with the same tone, the same posture, the same behavior he remembered, the rage buried deep within him erupted like it had never been silenced. He dug up all the paperwork, still intact in an old folder in the bottom drawer of his desk, and this time he resent everything, along with the recorded statement, directly to the Special Investigation Commission. Within 2 hours, the legal verification team confirmed Douglas Raines' file had been misclassified, placed under complaints ineligible for case review instead of incidents involving use of force. No internal review had ever been conducted. No investigator had been assigned. All that remained was a name, forgotten in every sense of the word. At an emergency meeting that afternoon after Raines's documentation was presented, the lead investigator stood up, looked directly at the team, and said, "We're no longer investigating a single incident. We're uncovering a chain of actions that show systemic signs, and we're starting by reopening every file connected to Rick Halverson from the past 10 years. Silence filled the room, but everyone present understood some stains don't vanish on their own. They just wait for the chance to rise to the surface. And this time, silence would no longer be a defensible option. Before the story of Douglas Raines could even settle, 3 more names surfaced, not from internal archives, but from comment threads, private messages, and emails sent to local newsrooms. An elementary school teacher from the next county, a long-haul trucker, a single mother raising 2 kids. They didn't know each other, but their stories shared the same script. Rick Halverson, a night stop, a vague excuse, a violent act, and a fear that hadn't left them since. The teacher spoke, her voice still trembling even though it had been over 4 years. She was pulled over by Rick for not driving on an approved school zone route. When she questioned the stop, Rick dragged her out of the car, slammed her bag onto the road, and threatened loudly to order a psychiatric background check. There was no video, no witnesses. She gave up after 3 days of unanswered complaints. The truck driver was made to sit on the pavement for nearly an hour for speaking with the wrong tone. He described Rick drawing his gun and repeating, "Try and open that door, see what happens." But no one believed him. There was no recording. The single mother simply wrote in one short sentence, "I've taught my children to go quiet when the police are near, not out of respect, but fear." A civil rights attorney began reviewing prior complaints linked to Rick and uncovered at least 3 formal reports that had been dismissed at the earliest stage, all following an eerily consistent protocol. No camera footage, no independent witness. Complaint labeled insufficient grounds for investigation. The problem wasn't just Rick, it was the people who approved that process, signed off on it, and treated it as standard. The press began asking pointed questions. Who approved these case closures? Has anyone ever re-examined those decisions? The question wasn't aimed at a single individual, but at an entire system that had constructed a wall of silence, where fear and lack of documentation were used as shields to protect corrupted power. Elijah Monroe, when informed of this cascade of testimonies, didn't give interviews. He made no public statements, but he sent one brief email to the investigative agency, just one line. It did to me. "I don't care what they did to me. I want to know how many people never got the chance to speak." That question echoed in a closed-door oversight council meeting on Friday afternoon. No one answered. No one rushed to defend themselves. Not until the session ended did one council member, who had quietly signed off on many non-actionable complaints in the past, turn to his assistant and say as they left, "This is no longer about investigating one officer. It's about re-examining how we've chosen silence all along. and from that moment forward, silence was no longer a safe option. Elijah received the handwritten note late in the afternoon, not by email, not through any official administrative channel. It was left on the table inside the Internal Affairs reception room, tucked neatly inside a thin folder. The handwriting slanted gently, careful but unadorned, like the way someone writes when they're unsure they have the right to speak. The first line read, "Karen Ellis, emergency nurse, Brenton County Medical Post." Below that, a message. "I don't know you, sir, but I think I once knew another version of the man who did to me what was done to you." No more details, but that was enough. Elijah requested a meeting. No wait lists, no press alert, no cameras. Karen arrived the next morning, pale blue shirt, hair tied back, no makeup. Her stride wasn't fast, but firm. When invited into a small meeting room at the back of the investigation office, she bowed slightly, then sat across from Elijah like she was walking into an emergency case, except this time, the one needing to stay alive wasn't on a stretcher, but buried in the memory she'd kept locked away. She began with a single, quiet sentence. "I don't intend to stay silent anymore." Elijah nodded, waiting for her to continue. Karen said that 3 years earlier, after a late shift, she was driving home on a deserted road near her house. Her headlights were on, her hospital ID still clipped to the medical bag in the back seat. Still, Rick Halverson stopped her. No siren, no stated reason. When she asked, he replied, "You're driving too slow. Looks like you're hiding something in that car." She was stunned, explained she'd just finished a 12-hour shift and was too tired to risk speeding. Rick stepped closer, tapped on the glass with a knuckle, then jerked his chin at her name badge. "Riding high on Medicaid. Huh? People like you think putting on white means you're somebody." Karen froze, not from the words, but the look in his eyes. She said she stayed silent the rest of the time, hoping not to make it worse. Elijah said nothing, but when she repeated Rick's exact words, unchanged, just a different setting, he looked up. In his mind echoed the things Rick had said on that fateful night. "You think you're better than us just because your clothes are pressed? Soldiers are just government payroll, thinking that makes you important." Not identical words, but the same poison at their core. A denial of value, of effort, of identity, all filtered through bias. Elijah looked at Karen, not to interrogate, not to probe, but to confirm. He knew that kind of violence well. It wasn't a strike. It was the slow crushing of a person through language, with labels. The system is always ready to believe. Karen sat upright. Her hands didn't shake, but she clasped them gently together, as if holding herself steady against slipping into the old defensive reflex. "I used to think it was just a bad situation," she said, "that maybe I was too sensitive or I misunderstood, but when I heard what he said to you, almost word for word, I knew I wasn't imagining it." Elijah remained silent. He didn't need to ask more. No need for verification. No official transcript, just the truth, and she had brought it. He placed a hand on the table, not in a slam, not in a grip, just a steady gesture, like anchoring something real. "You haven't been forgotten," he said, voice low and clear. The words weren't loud, but enough for Karen to exhale, for the first time since she entered. Enough for a woman once overpowered by authority to know her voice wouldn't vanish this time. Karen sat still for a while after Elijah spoke. The room seemed to freeze, not with tension, but with the quiet weight of two people from different worlds sharing the same rare feeling, the feeling of those who had once stayed silent. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thin stack of papers, not a full legal file, nor a formally prepared complaint, just a handwritten report, the ink still legible, with a red stamp at the bottom. "Case withdrawn, not pursued." She placed it in front of Elijah and said quietly, "I filed this back then, gave it to Internal Affairs. 3 days later I got a phone call. A man's voice, who didn't give his name, said that if I had no witnesses or footage, what I was doing might be considered defamation of an officer on duty, and that, he said, could seriously impact a healthcare worker's professional standing. I stayed silent. I had 2 kids and a job keeping food on the table. Elijah listened, his eyes fixed on the document. Karen went on, her voice steady like reciting an old wound. I told a few coworkers. Some said to let it go, not worth it. Others said if you're a black woman in healthcare trying to file against the police, you're only going to lose. I started doubting myself. Was I overreacting? Misremembering? Making things up from stress? She gave a quiet, half laugh, not mocking, just the laugh of someone who had doubted her own instincts for too long. But then I heard the clip, heard the exact words Rick used with you. Think wearing white makes you special, living off Medicaid. He didn't even come up with new lines. Just swapped you for her, nurse for soldier, and for the first time I knew I wasn't lying. Elijah straightened in his seat. The look he gave Karen wasn't pity nor consolation. It was the look of someone who's seen others break under truths too heavy for the world around them. Silence, he said, isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the only way to survive, but stepping out of it, that takes more than most people have. Karen nodded slightly. Her tears fell, but her posture didn't drop. She didn't wipe them away, didn't hide them. She accepted that the emotion finally had a place to land without being crushed. Before standing up, she pulled a blue pen from the folder. At the bottom of the old report, beneath the stamped line that read, "Complainant confirms case not pursued," she added a short, deliberate sentence, "I rescind my past withdrawal." She handed it to Elijah. He accepted it, set the pen down gently, then drew a single line through the words "not pursued." Not heavy-handed, not bold. Just one clean, final stroke. Below it, he signed his name with a note. This statement matches behavior previously documented and reported. Karen left. After that, no security escort, no press release, but her footsteps echoed down the hallway like a quiet declaration. People can be forced into silence, but the truth, once it finds something to lean on, will always find a way to stand. And this time, it stood in the voice of a woman, once silenced but never forgotten. Late afternoon. The intake room of the Internal Affairs Unit was nearly empty, with only a few staffers sorting paperwork before the end of their shift. Amid a pile of inter-office envelopes, one plain envelope, with no name, no postmark, no return address, was wedged between two stacks of blue folders. The desk officer was about to set it aside for later processing, but, upon opening it, found a small black USB drive and a single white sheet bearing just 3 handwritten words in bold, "Play back." The file was quickly escalated to the Special Review Office. Within an hour, it sat on the desk of Elijah Monroe, who, at this point, was not only the central witness, but also the only person with enough reason to fully grasp every word captured in the recording. He plugged the USB into an offline computer, put on his headphones, and opened the file labeled X1_OFFREC. There was no intro music, no cuts. The recording began abruptly with the sound of a car door slamming shut and faint police radio chatter in the background. After a few seconds of silence, Rick's voice came through. Clear, casual, unapologetic. "I'm telling you, any black guy driving something over 30 grand's got something dirty going on. Salary doesn't cover it, so it's either dealing or leeching. I soft-handle a couple of them, and the rest get the message. To stay humble." A soft chuckle followed, not Rick's. Then Jason's voice came in. Not objecting, just calmly echoing. "The slicker they look, the sketchier it gets. Always running some angle. I always check their wallets and glove boxes real close when I see those types. Never fails." Elijah sat upright, eyes fixed on the blank screen. He listened to the entire thing. No skipping, no pausing. The audio was clear. There was nothing vague, nothing to be taken out of context. These weren't fragments. They were 2 uniformed officers in a patrol car, openly discussing how they enforced prejudice against a specific group by soft-handling thorough searches and teaching them their place. He played it again, this time with the screen off, just the sound, not to hear better, but to separate form from content, to listen not as a victim, but as someone witnessing the kind of evidence that had dismissed countless past complaints as lacking verification. This time, nothing was lacking. Everything was here. In the laughter, in the agreement, in the way racism was spoken, like routine, like a system already hardwired. When the recording ended, Elijah remained seated for several more minutes in silence. Then he opened the internal mail client, created a message with no subject line, no long explanation. He simply attached the file and typed one sentence. Deliberate, stripped of flair or emotion, this should never have been needed if the system had listened when it should have. He hit send, not out of anger, not for revenge, but because the truth, once spoken, deserves to be heard to the end, and this time, he wouldn't let it be buried again. The internal affairs team didn't need long to verify the recording. Their audio analysis software confirmed the voices belonged to Rick Halverson and Jason Griggs. The timestamp matched a night patrol from exactly 2 months earlier, around 7 weeks before Elijah Monroe's traffic stop. Everything aligned. The location, the content, the unfiltered laughter. The only mystery that puzzled investigators was how this recording existed at all, and how it had escaped the official storage system. The answer came from an anonymous source. An email with no subject, sent from an internal address not registered under a real name, but with a short explanation. I'm the one who recorded that. I used to be a rookie under Rick. I'm not sending this to take anyone down just because I can't keep living with the guilt of staying silent. After a few steps of verification, investigators identified the sender as a young officer, still in the probationary period. He had been assigned to patrol with Rick for nearly a year, and during that time had been instructed at least 3 times to rewrite the report to match the narrative. On one occasion, Rick told him to state the suspect was showing resistance, when in fact the person had merely asked, "What did I do wrong?" Lacking the confidence to defy his superior, the officer had recorded every shift since being assigned to Rick, just to cover myself. That recording now pierced through the thick armor of the excuse-making machinery. Though the young officer remained anonymous, the internal affairs team acknowledged the tape was sufficient to confirm this was not an isolated act. It was systemic prejudice, repeated and reinforced by those entrusted with legal authority. When the report reached Elijah's office, he read it silently. No visible satisfaction, no smile. He sat for a long moment, as if calculating something. At the internal debrief the next day, when invited to speak, he stepped up without notes, without a speech. He simply said, "I don't want anyone demoted. I don't need names blasted on TV, but I want to speak to the ones who've heard talk like that, seen things like that, and told themselves that staying silent was the safest way to survive. They need to understand silence is complicity, and sometimes the cost of silence is greater than speaking out." The room went silent. No one objected, no one asked to leave. That same afternoon, the head of the Special Investigations Unit ordered a full audit of all patrol logs involving Rick Halverson and Jason Griggs over the past 3 years, including so-called off-frequency recordings. Conversations not broadcast through the official radio system, but locally stored on patrol units. A new system was being rebuilt, not out of vengeance, but to clear away the dust of years in which racism was mislabeled as minor misconduct, procedural error, or internal culture. Now, those jokes and smirks inside patrol cars were no longer private moments between 2 men. They had become a warning to everyone. Truth can stay quiet, but when it speaks, it never speaks alone. Jason Griggs' disciplinary case seemed to be following the proper course. After the leaked recording, the reopened complaints, and Jason's first evasive look when confronted, it appeared that everything was finally moving toward the truth. But on Tuesday afternoon, a strange document was delivered to the Internal Affairs Investigation Team, printed on smooth paper, formatted in the standard court style. Its title was highly technical. Request for review of procedural validity in the suspension of law enforcement personnel under internal investigation. No sender's name, no official seal. But it took only 2 hours to trace the printer's IP address. It came from the office of Judge Richard Griggs. Richard Griggs was Jason's father. a name well known in local law enforcement circles. 30 years as a defense attorney, 2 terms as Eastfield County judge, he was considered one of the most quietly influential figures in the local power structure. In every hearing involving police conduct, he always appeared in a neutral capacity, but his neutrality often meant delays, diluted conclusions, or deflected responsibility. Elijah Monroe received the internal report about the document's origin the next morning. He said nothing, made no statements, just took out his pen and wrote a single line in his notebook. When a chair tries to protect what's wrong, it ceases to be a seat of justice. But the one who didn't stay silent was Raymond Harper, the chief of police, who had personally ordered the suspensions of Rick and Jason. Harper knew Richard hadn't just sent a document. Judge Griggs had suggested directly over the phone to 3 members of the Internal Oversight Board, urging them to reconsider the necessity of interim disciplinary measures. No threats, no directives, just slippery language. I believe my son is simply a victim of a series of misunderstandings. Or, tensions are high. We don't need more reasons for the public to lose faith in the force. The 3 commissioners took notes, but none responded. One of them quietly forwarded a summary to Harper's office. The next day, Harper showed up at the county courthouse, requesting a private meeting. The conversation took place behind closed doors. No reporters, no third parties. Richard sat behind a dark wooden desk, one button on his judicial robe slightly off, not from carelessness, but because he still believed he was safe in the years-long comfort of unchecked authority. Harper didn't sit. He stood tall, hands clasped behind his back, voice even and cold. Judge Griggs, I'll keep this brief. We have documented at least 2 prior incidents of administrative interference from your office involving Jason Griggs in 2019 and 2021. Both cases were halted during the preliminary investigation phase. Now, we've also recorded that you directly contacted 3 board members attempting to influence the disciplinary handling of someone currently under investigation for abuse of power. Richard furrowed his brow, but didn't interrupt. Harper continued, "Let me be clear. If there's another call, another memo, another move that exerts pressure, we will go public with why you're doing it. And when that happens, your son won't be the only one affected." The words dropped like a stone into water. It took Richard a few seconds to collect himself. No shouting, no desk pounding, but in Harper's eyes was a declaration of war, one that didn't need an exclamation mark. Silence hung in the room a moment longer before Harper nodded once and walked out, leaving behind a man long accustomed to dispensing justice, now facing what he had spent a lifetime avoiding, the fact that justice was never meant to protect what he chose to preserve. The door shut behind him, and in that moment, the powerful seat Richard Griggs had occupied for decades no longer symbolized justice, but a silence, finally being named aloud. The story of Elijah Monroe had moved far beyond internal reports or courthouse corridors in a small county. It had crossed the line of a police abuse case and begun cutting into deeper layers of power. After the Rick and Jason recording went public and Judge Richard Griggs's backdoor interference was exposed, the press immediately began connecting the dots. A veteran investigative journalist from the Savannah Ledger reviewed dozens of civil suits dismissed during pretrial phases over the past decade. In 2 of the most notable cases, both involving excessive use of force during traffic stops, Jason Griggs was listed as the responding officer, but never as the named defendant. Both cases were thrown out for insufficient grounds to proceed with litigation, with one never even making it to hearing. Most notably, the presiding judge in both was Richard Griggs. When the question was raised publicly at a press conference at City Hall, Richard gave only a brief statement. "I believe in my son's character." He refused further comment. Calm face, measured words, but that brevity only stoked more doubt. If he truly believed, why intervene? And if he was impartial, why were his son's cases always dismissed so early? Soon after, the state's Judicial Oversight Council convened a closed-door meeting. No press, no spokesperson, only insiders speaking to insiders. Richard Griggs, once seen as a pillar of the local legal community, entered not with his old air of untouchability. Documents were presented, calls were listed, every gentle suggestion was cited. He reacted more sharply than usual, losing his usual composure for the first time. "You're attacking my family. I didn't issue any orders, I just shared my perspective with a few colleagues." One council member asked bluntly, "What perspective justifies calling 3 internal board members, people outside your judicial jurisdiction?" No clear answer. Just a heavy sigh and a quiet nod that said, "Yes, I suggested they go easy." Elijah Monroe received the update through internal channels. He wasn't surprised. At a public hearing on police accountability procedures, when asked his opinion on a judge interfering with an investigation, Elijah made one short statement. "As a father, I understand the instinct to protect your child. That's natural. But as a judge, if you trade justice for blood ties, you're not just betraying your oath to the law, you're betraying everyone who believed justice was their last refuge." No one in the room challenged him. No follow-up comment was needed. That statement landed like a quiet slap, undeniable, impossible to sidestep. 3 days later, the Judicial Disciplinary Board officially announced an ethics investigation into Judge Richard Griggs for abusing personal influence to interfere in the investigation and disciplinary proceedings of a law enforcement officer with a family connection. The chair that once seemed untouchable, the one raised above the courtroom floor, deciding which cases were fit for trial, was now under direct scrutiny. And for the first time in over 20 years, Richard Griggs was no longer the one asking the questions. He was the one answering them. The Internal Investigation Unit forwarded the original incident report, written by Rick Halverson, on the very night of the event, to Elijah Monroe's temporary office. The document was just 2 pages long, written in simple language but with clear intent. Rick described the stopped individual as black male, approximately in his 50s, appearing unsteady upon exiting the vehicle, and stated that the subject placed his hand near the left waistband as if reaching for an object, and used oppositional language when ordered to kneel. The sentences were neatly typed, properly formatted, standard for post-shift patrol reports, made to legitimize and institutionalize. Elijah said nothing as he received the papers. He read them slowly, pausing on certain carefully chosen phrases, not because he questioned the story, but because he recognized it as more than fabrication. It was a trained skill in institutional report writing, a legal mechanism built to recast reality in the most favorable light for the uniformed side. After a few minutes, he looked up and spoke, not loudly but with the gravity of a verdict. "Do you know the de-escalation principle? What's required when law enforcement engages with senior military personnel?" The investigation team exchanged glances. One admitted they weren't sure of the details. Elijah nodded, laid the report flat on the table and flipped to a highlighted section in his notebook. "This is Article 3, Section 4 of the Homeland Security Coordination Manual, a document I helped revise for the Department of Defense in 2008. It states, for all encounters with active duty or retired officers of rank 06 and above, local law enforcement must employ identification protocols, refrain from provocation, and are strictly prohibited from using force unless there is clear, documented, verifiable threat behavior captured by recording equipment." He paused, underlined 3 phrases in the report with his pen: appearing unsteady, placed hand, and oppositional language. Nowhere in any footage, whether dashcam or witness videos, was I seen moving unsteadily. I exited the vehicle using trained tactical protocol. The so-called hand-to-waistband was me reaching for ID as instructed. Barely 2 seconds later, I was forced to my knees. And the oppositional language? I didn't say a single disrespectful word until after I was kicked in the back. One investigator quietly noted, "Those phrases, they show up in many of Rick's previous reports." Elijah gave a slow nod. "They're stock phrases, like battlefield code words, but reversed. Not for saving lives, but for shielding misconduct. Choose the right language, and any natural reaction becomes resistance. Any movement for a wallet becomes reaching for a suspicious object. And if no one challenges it, it's accepted as fact." That afternoon, an internal meeting was called. Rick's report was projected side by side with Elijah's breakdown. No one disputed what had become clear. The document wasn't just wrong. It was designed to mislead. The report was formally flagged as a Level 1 administrative distortion risk, the highest classification reserved for records that, if treated as legal fact, could enable serious institutional violation. It was the first time a local patrol officer's incident report was disqualified based on federal-level tactical and legal standards. From that day on, any report authored by Rick, regardless of previous acceptance, was no longer considered presumptively factual. There was no sound in the room, not even the usual pen tapping or page turning. In front of the team was a red-bound volume, nearly 200 pages thick, titled Administrative Language Patterns Suggestive of Abuse, Rick Halverson File. Elijah stood at the front. No slides, no screen, just a sheet of paper underlined in red, listing identical language across over 30 incident reports. Appeared unsteady when exiting vehicle, reached toward the waistband area, exhibited oppositional tone under stress. He read each one aloud, without interpretation, letting them echo. Individually, they sounded harmless, but stacked over the years, they were no longer descriptive. They were tactical codes, scripted to reconstruct events in favor of power. One investigator asked, "Are you saying these phrases were taught?" Elijah nodded. "Not formally, but through culture. New officers learn fast which phrases don't get questioned, which wordings make a report bulletproof, and if the facts are wrong, the language is vague enough to avoid prosecution." He flipped quickly through the report stack. 2017, subject responded loudly when ordered to stop. 2019, male exhibited tension in tone, non-compliant when instructed to remain still. 2021, subject appeared upset when asked to open the trunk, suggesting concealment. Each line was vague enough to dodge responsibility, yet incriminating enough to justify force. A young staffer whispered, "This isn't a report. It's a script." The tactical documentation lead summarized, "Rick's reports aren't records. They're legal shields, designed to erase the real footprint of authority misused." Elijah didn't speak further, but as all eyes turned to him, he calmly closed the file in his hands, stood up straight, and ended the session with a single line. "The law does not exist to serve the selective memory of the writer. It exists to protect the truth, even when that truth is unpleasant." Silence fell, not as hesitation but as consensus. No one defended Rick. No one denied what was now undeniable. If this report hadn't been challenged, it would have continued to stand as truth, as justice, when in fact it was a shroud of carefully worded lies stamped with the legitimacy of the state. By that evening, the investigative team submitted a formal recommendation to the State Department of Justice to reopen every patrol report filed by Rick Halverson between 2015 and 2022 and to run them through linguistic pattern analysis. This was the first step, not in correcting a single act, but in dismantling a culture of language designed to legalize abuse, a culture that until now had never been brought to the operating table. And from now on, these wouldn't be seen as standard reports anymore. Late Wednesday morning, just as Elijah stepped out of a closed-door meeting with the investigation team, a receptionist from the Citizen Affairs Office approached and handed him a thin envelope. No security seal, no thick cover, just a plain, school-style envelope, scribbled in shaky purple point. To Mr. Elijah Monroe. The word Monroe had been crossed out and written again, darker and more deliberate, as if the sender feared not just getting the name wrong, but being ignored for it. Elijah accepted the envelope with both hands, said nothing, and carried it back to his office. He set it on his desk and spent several minutes just looking at it, not out of suspicion, but because there was something in the handwriting that made him pause, as if, for the first time in weeks, he was about to step into something not tied to a memo, a report, or a legal file. When he opened the envelope, inside was a folded sheet of lined school paper. The first line was written tight against the top edge, purple ink still slightly smudged from being pressed too hard. No title, no formal greeting, Just a story from someone trying to write without knowing if they had the right to do so. I don't understand everything, but I'm scared. I don't want my dad to end up like you. He wears a uniform too, but I know he's not a bad person. I just hope people won't hate all police." 3 lines had been scribbled out with a trembling hand, too faint for Elijah to fully read, but easy enough to guess. Additions the writer considered, then erased. At the bottom, a very small name tucked into the corner of the page, as if afraid to intrude on the rest. Lily Thomas, 12 years old. He set the paper down, leaned back in his chair, and stared at the words, "I'm scared." Not because fear was new, he'd heard hundreds speak of it. But this was the first time he saw a child not afraid of the police or the government, but of the rift growing between those in uniform and those without. Elijah said nothing during the afternoon meeting. When advisors asked if he wanted to approve the press summary, he just shook his head. The media coordinator reminded him, "At least 14 networks want interviews with you this week." Still silent. Not because he was avoiding anything, but because he knew none of his statements had ever moved things the way those shaky purple letters just had. As the afternoon waned, Elijah returned to his office, opened his personal laptop, a device he rarely used for external contact. His inbox was flooded. Interview requests, behind-the-scenes questions, invites to go live, messages from major outlets. He had refused them all before, but this time he read every line, then sat upright, opened a new draft. He didn't write much, just a subject line. "Ready to speak to media on case progress, not just for me." In the recipient field, he selected 3 media outlets he had declined the most, as if that history made this shift all the more meaningful. When his assistant knocked to hand over the final documents for signature, Elijah looked up and said, eyes still on the screen, "Schedule a press conference for tomorrow, not for me. For kids like that girl, the ones who think all adults have to pick a side." His voice wasn't loud, but as the assistant stepped out, he knew he'd just witnessed a turning point. Not in a legal case, but in a man who had once chosen silence, now deciding to let another voice speak for him. And that voice hadn't come from a podium, but from a 12-year-old's letter, with no power other than the rightness she believed in. There were no flags. No banners, no glossy backdrops or glittering nameplates. Elijah Monroe's press conference took place in a small room inside the Eastfield Public Library, once a community meeting space, now packed with reporters from local and national outlets. No music, no host, just plastic chairs, a single microphone, and a man in a white shirt and gray jacket. No uniform, no medals. Elijah entered on time, walking steadily, not fast. Camera lights swung to him like demanding eyes. But Elijah didn't step onto a stage, because there was no stage. He stood level with everyone, holding a school notebook page encased in plastic. Before anyone could ask a question, he raised his head. His voice was low but firm. "I didn't come here to present a report. I have no statement representing the military or any organization. I'm here because of a letter." He held up the page and flipped it around. It wasn't a formal statement, but faint purple ink, each word shaky yet honest. "This letter is from a 12-year-old girl named Lily Thomas. She doesn't live in the district. She's not connected to my case, but she said something I couldn't ignore. Fear." Elijah read the letter aloud. When he reached, "I don't want my dad to end up like you," his voice dipped a note, but did not break. He read it in full. No edits, no skipped lines. Then folded the letter and held it. "You are not wrong for being scared," he said for the first time, looking directly into the cameras. "And every father wants his child to grow up not having to dodge the truth. But we, adults, have created a world where that child can't tell justice from revenge, can't look at a uniform without flinching, and doesn't dare believe kindness can exist without conditions." He didn't mention Rick. He didn't mention Jason. He didn't cite stats or investigative process. He spoke only of choice and the cost of silence. "I refused to speak out many times, not because I was afraid to, but because I thought I didn't have to. That truth would survive on its own. I was wrong, not because I lost trust, but because others weaker than me paid the price I was lucky enough to avoid. He paused for several seconds, as if letting his words settle into a room built for press questions, not reflection. A society where children have to choose sides before they're old enough to vote is a society in need of healing. No one's born to defend police or condemn the military, but if even a child believes they must take sides just to survive, the fault isn't theirs, it's ours, for allowing the divide to grow unchecked, unchallenged. At last, Elijah smiled, not to soften the mood or perform, but simply to affirm the truth in his tone. I'm not here to be a symbol. I'm not a warrior. I'm not the ideal victim. I came here to say one thing. I heard her, and there are voices so quiet that if we don't go still, we'll miss them. He answered no questions afterward. As the mic went off, Elijah stepped away from the spot where he stood. No glance toward the cameras, no turn back. He walked straight, confidently, through the crowd of reporters flipping notebooks and rotating lenses the other way. At the door, he paused for a moment, reached into his inner pocket, and pulled out Lily's letter. He folded it carefully into 3 even parts, then opened the small notebook he always carried, the one that once held notes for operations, plans, and, later, details of an... He placed the letter between 2 blank pages, not to write over it, but to give it the place it deserved. Among the things worth remembering, not for protocol, for himself. And then he closed the notebook, not hurriedly, but as if he'd just closed the door out of a long shadow he'd stood in for too long, not for honor, but because one child had been brave enough to speak before an entire nation could find the word. On Saturday afternoon, the small barber shop on the corner of Mulberry Street, usually filled only with the sounds of clippers, scissors, and idle talk about the weather, suddenly became a space where live streams weren't used to show off new fades, but to share stories that had never been asked for. The owner, Terrence Wilson, 58, placed a phone on the coat rack stand, opened Instagram Live, and simply said, "I think it's time we told our own story." No one shouted. There was no explosive anger, just steady voices, occasionally pausing when the speaker had to decide whether or not to keep going. A woman in a thin wool cardigan, holding an old Kroger paper bag, sat in chair number 3. Her name was Dorothy Green, 74, a longtime resident just behind the Baptist church at the end of the block. Her voice was raspy and slow. "That year I was coming back from the store with groceries to cook for Easter. 2 young officers pulled me over, asked if I was distributing without a permit. They told me to pop the trunk. I was confused, but I didn't argue. I just stood there, worried they'd break my eggs." The room chuckled softly, but no one was actually laughing. Next was Malik, a senior math major at the local college. He spoke without hesitation, but never looked into the camera. "I got stopped while jogging one morning. They said I was moving in a direction inconsistent with normal pedestrian flow. Then I had to lie face down on the pavement, hands behind my back. No one recorded it. I had no proof, just this question stuck in my head. Maybe it's 'cause I'm black and tall." A middle-aged woman named Camille talked about being told to open her purse outside a mall just because she wore a hoodie and no jewelry. "Looked like someone skipping work to shoplift," said the officer. The stories weren't dramatic, no blood, no weapons, but they all shared one thing. They had never been told before, not because there wasn't a chance, but because no one had ever believed they were worth hearing. "These kinds of stories," Terrence said when the live stream paused, "we live with them like we live with the southern humidity. Everyone knows it's real, but no one thinks it's worth measuring. This time, though, what seemed unworthy was being documented. Every word, every pause, every sigh or silence was recorded and transcribed by 3 sociology students from the State University. They volunteered after watching Elijah's press conference. One of them said, "Mr. Monroe said the truth doesn't need to be pretty, just remembered. So this is how we remember." In a single week, 28 pages of testimony were collected. No repetition, no judgment, no clickbait. A local journalist who read the draft wrote a new proverb in the margins. They didn't come for blood. They came to say, "We've been here, no one ever asked." That weekend, the report was printed, signed by each storyteller, bound in plain cardstock and labeled with a small sticker, Community Record, Volume 1. It was hand-delivered to the Federal Investigative Task Force, not through official mail, but by a volunteer who had once been stopped for carrying a backpack with a historically black college logo. When Elijah Monroe received his copy, he didn't read it right away. He just rested his hand on the cover and nodded, because he knew this wasn't a document to analyze. It was a map of memory, written by those who had long been treated as bystanders, and now they had written themselves into the story, not through blood, not through protest, but through the most powerful act one can choose, to tell, without bitterness, without embellishment, just honestly, and that was enough. On Sunday night, warm yellow light fell across the side hall of Mount Jubilee Church in Southside, a room usually reserved for children's Bible lessons. But tonight the wooden chairs were pulled close, a microphone borrowed from the church PA system, and the message board outside swapped its usual sermon title for a new phrase. I stayed silent because I thought I didn't matter. The gathering wasn't a formal forum. There was no moderator. Reverend Clarence Duval, who had served the community for 28 years, simply opened with, "This isn't about who's right or wrong. This is a place to set down the stone on your chest, the one you've carried so long it felt like part of your body." Then he sat down and left the space open, and people stepped up. A young woman named Tanya recalled being pulled over 4 years ago, right in front of her house, because she matched the profile of someone with a prior in the neighborhood. She said she stood still, asked nothing, said nothing, just followed every order, even though she'd done nothing wrong. When friends asked why she didn't file a report, she replied, "Who would believe me?" A middle-aged man wearing an old high school football t-shirt said, "Rick pulled me over twice. First time for driving too slow in a quiet neighborhood. Second time for improper use of high beams. Never got a ticket, just got questioned. About my job, about any previous legal trouble. Even though I've never been arrested, I think I was under the microscope because my skin didn't match the zip code." An older man didn't give his name, just said one sentence. "I stayed silent for 22 years, until I saw Mr. Monroe didn't kneel, and lived to tell it." A reporter from a local paper asked, "Why speak now and not before?" It wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine question. An older black man, silver-haired, deep-voiced, stood up and replied simply, "Because this is the first time someone got pulled over, didn't bow, and lived to tell it. So for the first time, I believe that if I speak, someone might listen." No one applauded. No one needed to, because they weren't speaking for recognition. They were speaking to reclaim the parts of their voice lost on the days no one asked. 2 days later, a recording of the gathering was submitted to the Community Oversight Commission, accompanied by a proposal from Reverend Duval and a group of volunteers. We don't need a new investigative unit, but we do need a space to hold the words that were once ignored. The commission didn't take long to respond. They voted unanimously and announced a new initiative, the Informal Testimony Archive, an open room where anyone can share their experiences with law enforcement. No evidence required, no intake forms or scheduled interviews. Only one condition, the courage to speak. A former county records warehouse would be repurposed, not to store criminal files, but to house the stories once deemed too minor to document. When Elijah Monroe received the internal bulletin announcing the initiative, he simply smiled. He made no statement, just wrote one quiet line in the margin of his notebook. When silence is broken, truth doesn't need to scream, it only needs to keep echoing. The Eastfield Town Hall wasn't large, but that afternoon every seat was filled 20 minutes before the official start. Residents, reporters, council members, and a few community figures were all present. Not because the agenda held anything extraordinary, but because Elijah Monroe's name appeared on the public speaking schedule. The man who had turned down every media request, who had stood without banners, who rose from the pavement without a word, was now choosing to speak at the very heart of local authority. When Elijah entered, no one clapped. There was no need. The way people looked at him held all the respect he never asked for. He wore no uniform, no medals, no title, just a white shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he stood tall at the center microphone. "I didn't come here to be thanked. Elijah began, voice even and clear. "I came to remind you, if I weren't who I am, I might not be standing here at all." The room grew still. He didn't pause for long. With no script, no teleprompter, Elijah looked straight at the council members and spoke from memory. "I don't remember that night because it was horrible. I remember it because it felt like so many other nights when others never make it back to tell their side. I remember the flashing lights in the mirror. I remember footsteps approaching without explanation. And I remember holding my gaze, not to challenge anyone, but because I knew if I looked down, I might never look up again." He rested his hand lightly on the lectern. I read the report later. It said, "Signs of resistance." But that night, I said 4 words. "I will not kneel." If that counts as resistance, then print it across every file you want. No one interrupted. Some council members wrote notes. Others sat completely still, absorbing what was said with a rare kind of attention. Elijah kept going, calmly but firmly. "I'm not here to build a legacy. I don't need plaques or public honors. What I ask is simple. Define the limits that law enforcement must not cross, regardless of who's on the receiving end or who writes the report." He raised his gaze directly to the front row where the decision-makers sat. "Because if those limits remain vague, then everything I survived was just luck, not a lesson. And you cannot run a town on luck." A few deep breaths were heard. An older woman nodded. A man with a recording device stopped mid-click, not because of a technical error, but because he understood. These words weren't meant to be archived. They were meant to wake people up. Elijah didn't end with slogans or applause lines. He closed with a quiet reminder that sounded like a closing argument. "Don't let me be the last one who has to stand up for this. Let me be the last one who has to stand up for this." He nodded, stepped away from the mic, and sat down. No one interrupted him. No one clapped. But no one looked away either, because everyone knew this wasn't a speech meant to impress. It was a statement meant to shift responsibility from the man who was pulled over to the people who now held the power to stop it from happening again. As Elijah sat, the silence in the room didn't lift. It wasn't tension. It was something newly formed that no one wanted to disturb. Some council members flipped through papers by habit, but their eyes remained fixed on the man who had just spoken. One of them, the same one who had previously proposed honoring Elijah, now sat motionless, pen wedged between their fingers, not writing anything at all. A moment later, a parent stood and asked to speak. He was in his 50s, shirt wrinkled, southern accent strong. He didn't list a title, only said, "I'm the father of 2 kids, and it's been a long time since I've seen this room this quiet." Simple words, but everyone understood. In this very hall, there had been plenty of heated debates about budgets, zoning, development, but never a meeting where people simply listened to understand a person, not to respond to a policy. Elijah remained seated, silent. But when someone asked, "So what do you want?" after saying all this, he didn't take the mic again. He stood up, looked to the council, and replied calmly, "I don't want justice just for me. I want you to make sure the next person doesn't have to become a symbol just to be heard." There were no words like "I demand," no legal jargon, no dramatic phrasing, just a quiet warning. Subtle but deep enough to reach those who held the power. A young journalist from the local station scribbled a note. This wasn't a speech. This was a checkpoint, a place where we stop and ask, if I weren't Elijah, would anyone listen to me? Elijah stood a few seconds longer, then nodded as if to say, "That's enough." He left the row of seats and exited the hall in silence. No one blocked his path. No one chased him for interviews. Because they all knew he hadn't come to be asked questions, he had come to make others start asking their own. Before leaving the building, Elijah stopped at the door. He didn't look back at the room, just glanced left, at the wall lined with plaques listing every council member from years past. Some names he recognized, some he didn't. None made him pause. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small, folded note, Lily Thomas's letter, and carefully tucked it into his notebook, not as a keepsake, but as a map, because from one child's question, everything began to shift. And maybe, just maybe, that same question would teach the adults something they'd forgotten. Truth doesn't need a microphone. It only needs someone brave enough to speak. And those with power, they need to be brave enough to listen. On Monday morning, a staffer from the Internal Investigations Unit found an unmarked envelope on the records desk. No signature, no legal seal, no courier label. Just a folded sheet inside a plain brown envelope left on the desk in the internal file room, a place with no security camera and no staff after hours. Written in faint, tilted handwriting on the front was a single line. I used to think I didn't need to say anything. No name, but just a few lines into the letter, it was obvious who had written it. Jason Griggs had not appeared at any hearings since his suspension. No public defense, no legal statement, no comment to the press. For weeks, his silence was seen as strategy or as avoidance. But now, with carefully written blue ink on a single, undramatic page, that silence ended. I don't know where to begin, because there's no moment that truly deserves to be called the beginning. But one thing I do know, I used to think I didn't need to say anything, that if I stayed quiet it would pass, and I wouldn't have to bear the weight of something I only witnessed. I don't hate black people, I never claimed to be superior, but I was trained, not by a manual, but by a culture. I was taught to suspect first and explain later. I was taught how to write reports that were vague enough to avoid lawsuits, but heavy enough to justify force. I followed those lessons for years. Jason didn't blame Rick Halverson outright, but he referenced him repeatedly as a product of the culture that shaped me. He recalled early patrol shifts where Rick would say things like, "Teach 'em where the line is," and how during incident reports Rick would instruct, "Just make sure it says non-compliant somewhere." Jason didn't dramatize. He didn't beg for sympathy. He didn't write about financial pressure or being manipulated. He simply faced the system he had once defended and wrote, "I used to believe that following the process was the way to survive in this job. Now I see that process was built so people like me wouldn't have to pay the cost, and people like Elijah would pay it instead." The letter was only 3 pages long, but enough for the lead investigator to sign off. Release from confidentiality. Make the file public. That's how Jason Griggs, once considered part of the silent officers, was no longer labeled that way. Not because he was punished, but because he admitted something no lawyer softened, no phrasing sanitized. It wasn't a statement to save face, it was a break. In the afternoon briefing that day, when the team leader read Jason's final paragraph aloud, no one interrupted. I didn't write this to ask for reinstatement. I wrote it because I used to think I had nothing to say. Now I know, if I stay silent, then I'm part of the reason someone like Elijah has to speak up, and I don't want that to happen again. From that day forward, Jason was no longer the silent one. He didn't ask to be spared, but he did something most of his uniformed peers never had. He acknowledged, without bargaining, without filters, not to lessen his guilt, but to put a stop to its legacy. The letter wasn't broadcast. It wasn't headlined in the press. No talk show segment quoted it, but in closed-door meetings and community roundtables and in reform training sessions, it was printed, bound, not as an excuse, but as a reference point. In one part of the letter, Jason admitted, "I used to think that not breaking the law meant I was fine, but I forgot fine was built by pushing the worst of it onto someone else. In the department, we called stops that ended without lawsuits clean runs. We'd joke about it afterward. We even had internal awards. I remember plaques handed out after shifts that ended in clean handling, meaning someone got arrested, but no one complained." Jason didn't just confess his actions. He named the culture he once served. He wasn't afraid to write Rick Halverson's name directly. "I used to think he was tough. Now I know he was cruel, not for what he did in public, but for what he taught behind the scenes. He used to say, 'A good cop is one no one dares to sue,' and I believed him. I copied him." The letter didn't contain a direct apology. "No, I'm sorry, Mr. Monroe." But near the end, Jason wrote, "I didn't write this to ask for a job back. I don't want reinstatement. I just want those who used to call me their teammate to know. I see it now. And if they're still pretending not to, then they might be betrayed by me, the way I betrayed myself. Elijah Monroe received a copy of the letter. He didn't write a reply. He made no public statement, but he underlined the sentence where Jason wrote, "I wrote this because otherwise I'd go on being like them," and returned the copy to the investigation team with a short note. He didn't save himself, but maybe what he wrote will save someone after him. 3 days later, a copy of Jason's letter was printed, laminated, and posted on the inside of the door to the informal testimony archive, the space where anyone from the community could sit and speak their truth without evidence, paperwork, or fear. It wasn't glorified, no golden frame. The printout preserved his crossed-out words and the tilt in his final lines, as if written by someone still trembling. Beneath it, volunteers added a caption. "Not every apology comes on time, but every honest admission might keep someone else from needing to apologize." Jason Griggs hasn't reappeared. No one knows if he's still in town or already gone. But since the letter became public, officers who once worked beside him began quietly removing internal cheerleading posts. Some younger officers visited the archive. They didn't speak. They just stood and read the letter, start to finish. Some lingered longer, not to find something more, but as if asking themselves something they hadn't dared before. For Jason, the pen was once a tool to legitimize power, but the last time he picked it up, it didn't save him. It didn't spare him from accountability, but it broke off one piece of the system he helped build. And sometimes, as Elijah once said, truth doesn't need a microphone, it just needs someone willing to say it. Jason didn't speak first, but this time, he wasn't the last to stay silent. The press conference wasn't held at police headquarters or City Hall. Chief Raymond Harper chose an outdoor basketball court behind the public library, once a hotspot for random stop and frisks. No security barricades, no VIP seating, just a small wooden podium and a microphone. Behind Harper was a makeshift whiteboard with a handwritten line, "We're not repainting the car, we're changing how we drive." Harper stepped forward in his faded uniform. No nameplate, no medals, hands folded in front of him, eyes steady on the crowd. Reporters, residents, and especially young black men who had, for years, been pulled over, ordered to pop trunks, or detained for looking out of place. He didn't start with greetings, he just said, "We've had enough officers. What we haven't had are enough people doing the job like human beings." The crowd stirred. A few raised heads. Some snapped pictures. Most just waited, quietly, to see if this would be just another performance. Harper didn't make them wait. "I was the one who signed off on Rick Halverson's hiring in 1999. I approved internal protocols, including mechanisms that once allowed false reports to go unchallenged. I used to think good leadership meant keeping the department out of lawsuits. Now I see that's how someone protects a chair, not how someone earns public trust." He opened a file, pulled out a thick sheet. "As of today," he announced, "we're voiding 12 provisions from our internal operations protocol. Provisions that allowed delayed incident reporting, avoided community contact, and used administrative language to dodge real accountability." No applause, but people leaned in. They were listening. Harper continued, "We'll be restarting recruitment. Not the old way. New applicants must pass community evaluation, sit for at least 3 conversations with residents, engage in live debates with individuals impacted by systemic bias, and write a personal pledge based not on codes, but on values." A reporter asked, "Don't you think officers might feel humiliated by this?" Harper replied, "If someone feels humiliated by being asked to listen and engage, they shouldn't wear the badge." He flipped the page. "We're also ending the 2-tiered investigation system, where internal reviews were shielded. From now on, all civilian feedback will go straight to the Community Oversight Board before it returns to the department." Heads nodded, not in celebration but in recognition. This didn't sound like another PR move waiting to fade. Harper looked down at the file one last time, then closed it. "I'm not here asking you to trust me. I used to think my job was to keep the department upright. Now I know a department that stays upright by hiding the truth isn't worth keeping upright." He took a deep breath and closed with, "We don't need more officers. We need people who know what's right when no one's watching. People who know how to stop themselves when their power makes others tremble. People who understand that wearing a badge is a promise, not a shield. In the front row, Dorothy Green, the elderly woman once forced to open her trunk over too many Easter groceries, smiled faintly. Beside her, a student who had once been face down on the schoolyard for running in the wrong direction stood and quietly clapped. The court didn't erupt, but the few scattered claps that did rise were the clearest signal. These words weren't spoken to pacify the public. They were meant to change how power earns its peace. Harper didn't linger. He stepped off the podium and walked through the crowd like any citizen. No security detail, no escort. And for one brief moment, the very people who had lost faith in the system nodded back at him, not out of forgiveness, but because, for once, they weren't the ones forced to step forward first. The system had moved against the wind and spoken first. Elijah Monroe drove alone. No escort vehicles. No press tagging along, no camera crew capturing a hero returning to the scene. Just an early Monday morning, light mist still hanging in the air, and a silver-gray SUV gliding smoothly along an old, familiar stretch of asphalt. The road sat on the northern edge of town, where the white residential blocks met undeveloped public land. That night, over a year ago, he'd been stopped at this exact bend. No light. No warning signs. Elijah remembered the smell of damp roadside mud, the hard stomp of military boots on dirt, and the command as sharp as a blade, "Hands off your body. Get on your knees." But this morning the breeze was gentle, no sirens, no flashing lights breaking the stillness. Elijah turned off the radio, rolled down his left window, letting the air in, cool enough to remind his body it was alive, but not cold like the hollow chill in his chest back then. He hadn't come to prove anything to himself. This wasn't a ritual to sanctify a former nightmare. He came back simply to see whether the road, after everything, had truly changed. He stopped where the old paint lines still bore faint tire marks, turned off the engine. No one followed. No officer appeared. Across the street, an elderly couple watered their garden. A teenager pedaled by, nodded politely, and kept going. No one looked at him like a suspect. No one looked at him like a monument. Elijah opened the door, stepped out, unhurried. His soft-soled shoes touched the ground. No weapon, no badge. He just stood there, gazing toward the curve where Rick Halverson had once approached with a hand on his holster, and where Jason Griggs had hovered like a shadow. He thought he might feel rage or a scream rising, but no, only a stillness, so clear it felt like his mind had finally realized this place no longer held power over him. He walked slowly toward the roadside, the spot where he'd been kicked down, where his knee had hit the dirt. It was now lined with low shrubs, a new signpost installed. Speed check zone, all activity publicly monitored by camera. That sign was part of the reform measures passed after his testimony, but he hadn't come to inspect progress. He came to witness outcome. He sat on a new stone bench, part of a local community project. On the backrest, a stainless steel engraving read, "Let no one have to stand up just to survive." Elijah hadn't written it, but whoever did had clearly understood what he'd lived through. He read the line 3 times. The first time it felt like memory, the second like a question, the third like truth. Across the street, a patrol car passed slowly. The officer in the driver's seat, a young woman, lowered her window, nodded. Elijah nodded back. Neither of them spoke, but in that exchange there was no tension, no guarded pause, only the one thing he had spent a lifetime reclaiming, the right to simply be. He rose, walked back to his car. Each step felt lighter than the last, not because he had forgiven the road, but because it no longer had the power to define him. Before getting in, Elijah pulled out his notebook. The last page was still blank. He didn't write much, just one line. "I returned to where it began, not to end it, but to confirm I've moved through it." He closed the book and started the engine. The SUV rolled east toward the rising sun. In the rearview mirror, The curve where he'd once been pinned to the ground shrank into the distance, no longer a scar, no longer a boundary, just an old road, driven again, and this time no one stopped him. Elijah Monroe never liked public speaking, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he knew too well the weight of a sentence, especially when spoken by someone who had survived deliberate silences. But on that day, at the state's first civil forum following a wave of reforms, Elijah took the stage. One last time. There was no MC, no cheerleading intro. He'd been invited by a high school teacher who had used his case as a civic lesson. The forum was held in the town library's small conference room with fewer than 100 seats. Every one was filled, not because of Elijah's reputation, but because this time people came to hear him end the story, not explain it, but mark its closing. Elijah stood in the quiet room. No microphone, no podium, just a piece of paper folded into quarters, held in his hand. He didn't start with a memory. He started with reality. People often ask me, did I survive because I was a colonel? Did justice answer me only because I had a line to the Pentagon? He paused, and I always answer honestly, maybe, yes. The room held its breath. Elijah looked around. Then he continued slowly but firmly. But it's the next question that keeps me awake. What if I wasn't a colonel that night? What if I had no rank, no connections, no medals? Would I still have been heard? Or would I have been another name scrolling past the morning news, lost in the list of those handled by protocol? He paused again, letting the question settle, then looked up. I'm not here to thank anyone for defending me. I'm here to ask, why must someone need defending to receive justice? A young woman, a freelance reporter, lowered her pen. A student in the back looked down, then up, eyes wide. The rest remained still, not avoiding, just absorbing. Elijah didn't retell the night of the stop. He didn't mention Rick or Jason. He spoke beyond names. I don't want my story taught as a morality lesson. I want it known as a systemic failure, corrected. Because justice, if reserved only for the flawless, the decorated, the well-ranked, isn't justice. It's privilege dressed as fairness. The moderator nodded faintly, hand pressed to the table's edge. The pastor in the back row exhaled softly, eyes closed. Elijah finally unfolded the paper. One line was written on it. He read aloud, "Justice should not depend on rank. It should be a default right of being human." He folded it again, tucked it into his shirt pocket. We've spent too many years treating survival as victory. It's time we treat not needing to call anyone as the foundation of a real society. This time, the room didn't stay silent. It breathed in, together. No applause, but every face held one thing in common: awareness. Elijah stepped off the low platform. He didn't pause, didn't look back. He walked past rows of citizens, students, people once pulled over, people who once stayed quiet. Each nod, each glance said what words didn't. We hear you. You won't walk alone again. And so he walked out, not as a symbol, but as a final period. Not to end the pain, but to end a system that once believed peace belonged only to those with a title. This time, Elijah didn't need the Pentagon. He didn't need to cite his record. He didn't need to recount every second with a gun to his head. He just needed to stand and leave behind what no rank could give or take, the dignity of being human, and a voice not loud, just right, lessons and social message. The story of Elijah Monroe isn't just about reclaiming the truth. It's a wake-up call to a society long conditioned to judge people by appearance, title, or skin color. Elijah didn't survive because he was lucky. He survived because he had the dignity, strength, and clarity to stand upright in a system that expected him to kneel. From a man held at gunpoint in the street for being a black guy driving a nice car through the wrong area, he forced an entire town and an entire system to reevaluate how it defines danger. But the real message doesn't lie in his military record or his rank. It lies in this: even those without a uniform deserve to be treated with fairness. The biggest lesson from his story is this: don't rush to judge someone before you understand who they are. A person's worth and talent aren't found in their background or appearance, but in their integrity and actions. And justice, though delayed, always finds a way to win. Have you ever been misjudged by someone who didn't really know you? Have you ever been underestimated, only to prove you were more capable than they ever imagined? If this story made you think, share it so others can learn too. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more real, inspiring stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things.